Tonight, you are the last one left. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a way you would notice walking to work or sitting in traffic or scrolling through your phone, but in a biological sense, in a deep evolutionary sense, you are the sole survivor of an entire genus that once had company. There were others, real others, not primitive grunting cavemen from a cartoon, actual human species with big brains and social lives and tools and fire and probably something that looked a lot like language. They walked this earth. They raised children. They buried their dead. And then they were gone. Every single one of them, gone. And you are what remains. So the question that should bother you more than it does is this: why them and not you? For most of human history, that question did not have a good answer. Scientists assumed the other species were simply inferior, slower, dumber, less adapted. Natural selection did its work, and the best model won. Simple, clean, satisfying. But the more researchers dig, the more that story falls apart, because the others were not weak. They were not failures. Neanderthals, for example, had brains that were on average slightly larger than yours. They made jewelry. They mixed pigments, they played instruments, they cared for their injured and their elderly, which means they had empathy. They had something worth calling culture. Homo heidelbergensis hunted giant elephants with coordinated group strategies. Homo erectus survived for nearly 2 million years, which makes your species, at roughly 300,000 years old, look like a newcomer. Denisovans, discovered only in 2010 from a single finger bone in a Siberian cave, had a genetic profile so distinct they represented an entirely separate human lineage nobody even knew existed. These were not failed experiments. These were successful species with deep histories. So what happened? Paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London has spent decades mapping the spread of Homo sapiens out of Africa, and what he found complicates everything. The timeline of our expansion tracks almost perfectly with the disappearance of every other human species on every continent we entered. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. The simplest explanation is competition. When your ancestors arrived somewhere new, they moved into territory already occupied by another human species. They competed for the same food, the same water sources, the same shelter. And in that competition, Homo sapiens won. Every time, on every continent. But why? One answer is technology, not in the sense of smartphones or satellites, but in the sense of tools and weapons that were a generation ahead of everything else. Your ancestors made composite tools, meaning tools made from multiple materials bound together. A wooden shaft with a sharpened stone tip attached with resin and sinew. That might sound simple, but it represents a kind of planning that requires holding an abstract future in your mind. You are not just shaping a rock. You are imagining a tool that does not yet exist and working backward from that vision to build it. There is evidence Neanderthals did this too, occasionally, but not with the same consistency, not with the same creative variation. Your ancestors were iterating, experimenting, failing, and trying again. That gap, even if it was small, would compound over generations into an enormous advantage in hunting efficiency. But technology alone does not explain the speed of the extinctions. Something else was happening. Researcher Joseph Henrich at Harvard University argues in his work on cultural evolution that what made Homo sapiens uniquely dangerous was not individual intelligence, but collective intelligence. The ability to accumulate knowledge across generations, to store information, not just in brains, but in stories, rituals, symbols, and social networks. A single Neanderthal might have been just as smart as a single Homo sapiens, maybe smarter, but a group of Homo sapiens was connected to other groups. Innovations could spread, trade routes formed, knowledge about distant terrain and distant animals and distant dangers could move hundreds of miles through social networks before your ancestor ever set foot in a new landscape. Neanderthals appeared to have lived in smaller, more isolated groups. Their tools stayed largely the same for hundreds of thousands of years. Not because they were incapable of innovation, but because their social networks could not carry innovation forward the way yours could. Your ancestors did not just outfight the competition, they out-networked it. And then there is the question that nobody likes to say out loud. Was it violence? Some archaeologists believe the answer is yes. Not necessarily organized warfare, but persistent, low-level conflict. Competition over territory. Raiding. The The kind of friction that, sustained over centuries, can reduce a small isolated population to nothing. Paleontologist Nicholas Conard at the University of Tübingen has studied sites in Germany where Neanderthal populations seem to have retreated steadily as Homo sapiens expanded into Europe. The retreats track our arrivals. The disappearances follow our presence. But here is where it gets genuinely strange, because the story is not one of pure replacement. When researchers sequenced the Neanderthal genome in 2010, led by Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, they found something unexpected. If you are of non-African descent, between 1 and 4% of your DNA is Neanderthal. Your ancestors did not just compete with Neanderthals, they interbred with them. The two populations overlapped for thousands of years. There were children, there was some form of contact beyond violence, and when the Denisovan genome was analyzed, it turned out that modern populations in Southeast Asia and the Pacific carry between 3 and 5% Denisovan DNA. In some Aboriginal Australian populations, that number is even higher. The others did not vanish entirely. They are inside you. So what does this tell you? It tells you that the story of human extinction is not a story of monsters and victims, of superior and inferior. It is a story of competition, absorption, adaptation, and loss happening all at once. Some populations of other human species were outcompeted into collapse. Some were absorbed through interbreeding until their distinct lineage dissolved. Some may have died from diseases your ancestors carried without symptoms, but that devastated immune systems with no prior exposure. The same thing your ancestors would later do to isolated human populations in the age of colonization. And some simply ran out of time. Climate was shifting, landscapes were changing, resources were thinning, and a species with smaller, more isolated social networks, with less flexibility in its tools and trade and cultural memory, had nowhere left to go. The Neanderthals' last known refuge was the southern tip of Spain, a thin strip of coastline where they held on for thousands of years after disappearing everywhere else in Europe. And then, around 40,000 years ago, they were gone. The world became quieter, the genus became singular, and the species that remained spread across every continent, every climate zone, every ecological niche on the planet. Your species, the one that out-networked, out-adapted, and in some cases, outbred every competitor it ever encountered. But here is what should stay with you. The traits that made your ancestors survivors are the same traits that still run your daily life. Your compulsion to share information, to gossip, to build networks, to accumulate and transmit knowledge, to cooperate with strangers, to trade, to form coalitions. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient weapons. The same weapons that, for better or worse, cleared the field of every other human species that ever existed. When you share something with a stranger, when you join a group, when you pass on a piece of knowledge to someone who will pass it to someone else, you are doing exactly what your ancestors did 50,000 years ago when they spread across a world that was not yet entirely theirs. You are still the last one left, and now you know exactly how that happened.